There are nights that feel wrong before anything actually happens, nights when the air is too still, the dogs bark at empty streets, and entire neighborhoods seem to hold their breath without knowing why. Guadalajara, bright, loud, alive, knows nights like this. But none quite like the one you're about to enter. In the city's long history, full of beauty, resilience, and complexity, few moments carry the weight of what unfolded here. Few nights changed the mood of an entire metropolis. Few nights spread whispers so chilling they traveled farther than any siren. This is the story of one such night. A night when silence came first. And violence followed like a shadow. Yet this isn't a tale that begins with gunfire. It starts much earlier, in boardrooms and backstreets, in whispered conversations, in rising tension between powerful factions inside one of the most influential criminal organizations in modern Mexico. Information available to the public paints the outline clearly, stress lines forming, alliances straining, command structures bending under the weight of ambition. And though no one could see the whole picture at the time, many felt something was coming. Residents later described the same sensation in interviews and local reports. A heaviness. A stillness. A kind of invisible pressure that settles over a city just before control slips from the hands that once held it tightly. The sun set like any other evening, leaving Guadalajara draped in warm gold. Families ate dinner, bars filled, motorcycles buzzed through intersections. Nothing looked unusual. But beneath the surface, both law enforcement chatter and street-level rumor mills were vibrating with movement. Convoys spotted heading south. Motorcyclists taking unusual routes. A surge of encrypted messages captured by monitoring systems. Vehicles parked with lights off for too long. Safe houses where men entered but did not leave. Signs of shifting power that, in hindsight, were warnings. People living in neighborhoods from Zapopan to Tlaquepaque reported something off in the atmosphere, a strange quiet between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. that made even the usual city noise feel distant, muffled, as if swallowed by the night. Parents told their kids to stay inside. Shopkeepers closed early. And though no official alert had been issued, many locked their doors with an uneasiness they couldn't explain. Guadalajara wasn't new to tension. Across public reports, analysts often describe Jalisco as a region whose criminal landscape has been shaped by shifting coalitions, territorial disputes, and internal power dynamics for years. But this night felt different. News outlets would later publish timelines showing how the first signs appeared long before midnight. A burning vehicle on a quiet stretch of road. A group of masked men spotted near an intersection usually patrolled by municipal police. A neighbor reporting engines revving in the alley behind his house, engines that went silent the second he peered through his curtains. These little signals didn't make sense then, but together they formed the prelude. The night didn't start with chaos. It started with calibration. And then came the silence. Not the gentle silence of a city settling into sleep, this was a forced silence. A watchful silence. A silence that made the hair rise on the back of your neck. Residents described it as the kind that makes you stop mid-step, listen twice, and check the street again even if you just looked. It was the silence of tension coiled tight and ready to snap. Public sources later revealed something else. The internal rivalry inside the organization had reached a tipping point. Two factions, each believing it held the rightful claim to influence and territory, were no longer negotiating. No longer cooperating. No longer pretending. They were preparing. According to analysts, this was when Guadalajara shifted from a city under tension to a city unknowingly standing at the edge of a fracture. A fracture that would break open in the most visible, violent way possible. Some say the spark was a message, a brief transmission reportedly intercepted that night. Others say it was the moment a convoy of vehicles without plates began moving in synchronized formation. Others believe it was a retaliatory action for something that happened days earlier. Whatever the truth, one fact is clear. The silence didn't last. At 10:27 p.m., according to radio chatter later referenced in local reporting, the first irregular sound echoed across the district. A small explosion. A burst of engine noise. A sound that made every dog in the neighborhood start barking. A few streets away, a woman sitting on her balcony heard 3 motorcycles cut their engines at the same time, and the silence after was somehow louder than the noise before. Then came the turning point, a detail mentioned in multiple public accounts. The moment streetlights in certain pockets of the city flickered, dimmed, and went out. Darkness. Thick, full, unnatural darkness that covered entire blocks. People opened their windows. Looked out. Saw nothing. Heard nothing. Felt everything. If fear had a sound, it would be this silence. And then, without warning, the city exhaled violence. A burst of gunfire. Then another. And another. Echoes bouncing off buildings, turning every street into a question. Who is attacking? Who is being attacked? How far is it from here? Phones lit up. Messages raced through group chats. Stay inside. Turn off your lights. Don't go near the windows. This is when Guadalajara realized the truth. The night wasn't random. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't isolated. It was orchestrated, a coordinated display of force carried out across multiple points, almost simultaneously, reflecting a level of planning that chilled even those accustomed to the harsh reality of cartel conflicts in Mexico. Publicly available analyses would later emphasize how the pattern resembled a decisive internal confrontation, a power struggle spilling out from the shadows and into open streets. In certain areas, vehicles burned. In others, shots fired from moving convoys. In others still, people reported masked figures giving curt, urgent commands, then vanishing back into the dark. A city of millions held hostage by a conflict between factions few would ever see, yet everyone would feel. Hours earlier, everything had seemed normal. Now, the air was thick with smoke and fear. A wrong turn, a wrong corner, even a wrong noise could place someone in the crossfire. For many, the night felt endless. And yet, as terrifying as the violence was, the stories that emerged afterward, survivors, eyewitnesses, families hiding in silence, reveal something even more haunting. The most dangerous part wasn't what people saw. It was what they didn't. Because behind every gunshot, every burning car, every masked convoy, lay a deeper question, one that news reports and investigators would spend months untangling afterward. What exactly caused this break? What ambition? What betrayal? What decision inside the organization pushed Guadalajara into its darkest hours? That is the story we are about to unravel. Not just what happened, but why it happened. How a silent power struggle grew into a full eruption. And how one night left scars still visible in public memory, security reports, and the way people move through their streets even today. This story does not move backward. It moves deeper. And everything begins with the roots of power that shaped this conflict long before the first bullet was fired. This is where the night truly began. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. Before the night Guadalajara fell into darkness, before the convoys, before the burning vehicles and the fear gripping entire districts, there was a rise. A rise rooted in the very soil of Jalisco, shaped by the history of a region that had long been a crossroads for commerce, migration, influence, and conflict. Every story of a violent rupture begins with a structure that once held firm. To understand that night, we must understand the system that existed long before it. A system built over decades. A system that grew, mutated, and adapted as Mexico's criminal landscape shifted like tectonic plates beneath its surface. And it begins not with violence, but with opportunity, the kind that appears when geography, power, and desperation collide. Jalisco, long before the headlines, had become a strategic corridor. Public analyses often point out why. Roads that link the Pacific to Mexico's interior, dense urban zones mixed with rural shelter, and a booming local economy that could mask illicit activity behind legitimate industry. This region wasn't just valuable, it was coveted. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Mexico's criminal map was redrawn again and again. Larger organizations fractured, alliances crumbled, new players emerged. With every collapse, another opportunity opened, a space waiting to be filled. In those years, reports describe Jalisco as a place where a new criminal power base began to form, shaped by younger, more ambitious factions. These were groups that understood the changing rules of organized crime, rapid expansion, diversified income, the use of technology, and a modern, corporate-like approach to logistics. To locals, the shift was gradual at first, a subtle change in who controlled what, which streets belonged to whom, which businesses answered to which men. But to analysts following the evolution of Mexico's security landscape, the signs were clear: Jalisco was becoming a pillar of power. And rising power always brings internal competition. The early structure of this criminal organization, assembled from fragments of older networks, local alliances, and returning operatives from other regions, relied heavily on loyalty, discipline, and shared purpose. For a time, it worked. The organization expanded rapidly, gaining influence both inside the state and across multiple regions of Mexico. But as public studies show again and again in cartel history, every rise plants the seed of its own fall. Because once an organization becomes powerful, it no longer functions like a single organism. It becomes many organs, each with its own rhythm, its own purpose, its own leadership. Some cooperate. Some tolerate. And some wait. Behind the growth of any major criminal group lies a truth few speak aloud: success creates factions. Factions create rivalries. And rivalries create fractures. To truly understand the night that ripped across Guadalajara, we must understand how these fractures formed, years before the first bullet was fired. In the early days, according to public reporting and academic research, the group operated with a relatively unified leadership structure. Roles were defined, routes were protected, and discipline was enforced with ruthless consistency. This unity allowed the organization to expand faster than almost anyone expected. But rapid expansion requires something dangerous: delegation. Suddenly, territory that had once been overseen by one trusted leader was now divided among many lieutenants. New revenue streams meant new administrators. New alliances meant new negotiators. And each of these men began building their own networks. Their own circles. Their own ambitions. Power never stays in one pair of hands for long. Public analysis of cartel fragmentation across Mexico shows a clear pattern. When a criminal group grows too large, its leadership becomes less about cooperation and more about influence. Factions start keeping score, quietly, subtly, secretly. Every deal is measured. Every decision weighed. Every promise listened to with suspicion. This is the environment in which the seeds of that night were planted. Because within this expanding organization were two rising forces, two factions whose leaders, strategies, and worldviews were fundamentally different. Their identities, roles, and histories are publicly debated and documented in various forms, but for the purpose of this story, and in respect of accuracy and safety, we focus on the dynamic, not the individuals. One faction valued discipline, structure, predictability. They believed in long-term control and the stability that comes from calculated decisions. A machine that runs smoothly. The other faction valued aggression, speed, and visible force. They believed that power was not something to be managed quietly, but something to be demonstrated, publicly, unmistakably, undeniably. A machine that wins by overwhelming. Two philosophies. Two visions. One organization that was never meant to contain both. At first, their rivalry played out in shadows. A withheld resource. A delayed payment. A disputed decision. The kind of internal friction that rarely reaches the streets until it does. Because power struggles inside organized crime don't explode immediately. They simmer. They grind. They test the limits of loyalty, especially when loyal men start seeing opportunities to shift their allegiance toward whichever faction looks stronger. Public research into cartel dynamics highlights that these internal battles often begin far from public view, in private ranches, warehouses, foreign cities, coded conversations, and split-second decisions made in rooms without windows. All of this was happening long before Guadalajara's streets went dark. Meanwhile, the community saw something else entirely. They saw a city modernizing. Business districts growing. New roads being built. Tourists arriving. Families feeling safer than they did in the turbulent years when Mexico as a whole wrestled with widespread conflict. Even as tensions beneath the surface rose, Guadalajara's surface gleamed. But beneath that gleam, the power struggle intensified. Every organization has a moment when unity fractures, a moment when a single disagreement becomes a symbol of something larger. Researchers studying cartel behavior often note that this moment is rarely recognized when it happens. Sometimes it's a mishandled operation. Sometimes it's a disagreement over territory. Sometimes it's a personal betrayal disguised as a professional dispute. Whatever form it takes, the outcome is always the same. A countdown begins. In Jalisco, that countdown was invisible to the public, but unmistakable to those within the organization. Whispers replaced conversations. Suspicion replaced trust. Every action was interpreted as a potential move in a larger, unseen game. The organization that once moved as a single force was now becoming two forces trapped in the same cage. In Guadalajara, vibrant, sprawling, alive, was the stage. What makes this even more chilling is that the public had no warning. No headline. No leaked message. No alert saying that the balance of power inside one of Mexico's most influential criminal networks was slipping. But those close to the inner workings could feel it. Public interviews later conducted with analysts, security experts, and residents all reflect the same sentiment. There was a shift. A tension. A change in the way the organization distributed its influence. And across the city, small things began to feel off. Patrol patterns looked different. Certain streets saw fewer watchers than before. Some businesses suddenly switched who they paid protection to. People who once stood together now arrived separately, or didn't show up at all. These changes didn't alarm the public. But for those who lived closest to these networks, they were unmistakable signs that something inside the organization was breaking. And once that break began, the countdown accelerated. Because this wasn't just a disagreement. It was a divergence. A split between two visions of power, two strategies of control, two ways of ruling a territory too valuable to share. Everything that happened on the night Guadalajara ran red. Everything the public witnessed. Everything captured in videos, reports, and shaken testimonies was the eruption of this fracture. But before the chaos came the miscalculations. The movements. The secrets. The moment when one faction made a decision the other could no longer ignore. In that moment, the first true spark, is where our story goes next. Power is rarely a single flame. It is usually two torches carried by two men walking side by side, until one steps slightly ahead of the other. And in the world of organized crime, even a single step is enough to start a war. The rise of the criminal network operating across Jalisco had created a system that was powerful, expansive, and frighteningly efficient. But with rapid growth came something inevitable: leadership was no longer a crown worn by one head. It became a prize sought by many. Public analyses of cartel evolution in Mexico often point to this exact pattern. When a criminal group becomes too rich, too connected, and too influential, it stops functioning as a single body. It becomes a cluster of competing centers of gravity. And each one wants to pull the universe toward itself. Inside this organization, two of those gravitational centers grew brighter than the rest. For the sake of clarity, and out of respect for accuracy, we will not focus on names or specifics. Instead, we examine the power structures, strategies, and philosophies that rose to dominance. Because it wasn't about who these leaders were. It was about what they represented. One leader symbolized structure and order. The other symbolized force and expansion. These opposing visions are well documented in research on the internal dynamics of organized crime. One faction believes survival comes from discipline, rules, and predictable operation. The other believes survival comes from overwhelming strength, rapid expansion, and fearlessness. These philosophies had existed side by side for years. But as the organization grew, stretching across regions, markets, and networks, they began to collide. And Guadalajara was the fault line. The structured faction favored stability. Their operations were quiet, calculated, almost corporate in their method. They saw the organization as a system, one that needed consistency, loyalty, and slow, steady expansion. Their approach was built on patience, on maintaining relationships, on the belief that power held for a long time was more valuable than power grabbed too quickly. The opposing faction believed in momentum, acceleration, dominance. They saw hesitation as weakness, compromise as a liability, and fear, the fear their actions inspired, as a tool more powerful than any negotiation. Two approaches. Two strategies. Two visions for the future. And both believed they were right. According to publicly available sources, analysts observed that criminal groups across Mexico often fracture along these philosophical lines. It isn't personal at first. It's structural. Strategic. A disagreement over what the future should look like. But over time, strategy becomes identity. Identity becomes ego. And ego becomes conflict. By the early 2020s, the organization's rapid territorial expansion had stretched both factions to their limits. Every new region brought new opportunities, and new disagreements over how those opportunities should be managed. The structured faction wanted to stabilize, consolidate. The foundation must hold, their philosophy implied. The aggressive faction wanted to push, advance. If you don't expand, someone else will, their philosophy insisted. These weren't just different opinions. They were incompatible worldviews. Public reports from security experts paint a consistent picture. as the stakes rose, so did the tension between these approaches. Meetings grew longer. Voices grew sharper. Orders grew contradictory. A lieutenant would receive instructions from one faction, then different instructions from the other. Territories that were once clearly assigned now had overlapping authority. Revenue that once flowed through a single pipeline now flowed through two, each side watching how much the other was collecting. And slowly, silently, loyalties began to shift. Human nature plays a predictable role in every power struggle. People follow strength, influence, or future promise. Members of the organization began to gravitate toward the faction whose vision matched their own, or whose protection they believed would be stronger in the long run. And this is where the rivalry truly begins, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet sorting. Public records and investigative articles describe similar internal divides across other Mexican organizations. Drivers, lookouts, accountants, planners, enforcers, all subconsciously choosing a side. Loyalty, once firm, began to blur. The structured faction noticed soldiers attending meetings they weren't invited to. The aggressive faction noticed shipments being rerouted without explanation. Each side interpreted the other's moves as provocations. Suspicion grew. This was the phase analysts call the silent fracture. The point where everything still seems under control. But isn't. One example often cited in reporting across the country is the shift in communication patterns. Messages delayed, calls not returned, meetings rescheduled. Even small acts, a missed handshake, a late payment, become meaningful. Inside Guadalajara, this tension wasn't visible to the public. But those operating near the organization's edges could feel it as clearly as a change in the weather. Associates began traveling with more protection. Certain neighborhoods saw new lookouts on rooftops. Business owners whispered that two different groups were asking the same questions. Even police patrol logs, when reviewed later, hinted at unusual movement patterns. A city knows when something is wrong, even if it doesn't know what. Meanwhile, inside the organization, both factions began reinforcing their positions. The structured faction tightened its internal controls. Reviewing routes, checking loyalties, quietly assessing which lieutenants were drifting away. The aggressive faction increased its foot presence, bolstered its manpower, and pushed harder into contested areas, a clear signal that they were no longer content to share influence. Neither side openly declared a challenge. They didn't need to. The challenge was written into every decision both factions made. The city, without knowing it, became a chessboard. Public analyses of Mexico's security landscape describe Guadalajara as a strategic hub, both economically and geographically. Control over it wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. Both factions knew this. Both needed the city to strengthen their position. And neither would let the other claim it unchallenged. In this tense period, confrontations were still avoided. No open war. No open declaration. No obvious signs for the public to see. But inside safehouses, warehouses, and unmarked vehicles, the atmosphere was electric. Long conversations. Uncomfortable silences. Men who once stood side by side now refusing to meet each other's eyes. The organization was still whole, on paper. But split in spirit. External pressure made everything worse. Public reporting shows that rival groups were watching closely, political dynamics were shifting, and law enforcement operations were increasing across the region. Stress, pressure, ambition, distrust, all compacted together. A system built by cooperation was now bowing under competition. A leadership built on unity was now cracking under rivalry. And like all great fractures, it didn't break in one moment. It cracked slowly. Quietly. through 100 small decisions made in 100 small rooms. Until finally, one decision went too far. One order crossed a line. One movement signaled the moment when the rivalry could no longer stay hidden. A point of no return. And the night that would later engulf Guadalajara. The night that would send shockwaves through the entire region. The night that began in silence and ended in chaos. Began with that moment. The trigger. The betrayal, intentional or accidental, that neither faction could ignore. Before the night of chaos, before the gunfire and the panic, before Guadalajara became the center of a storm that had been building for years, the city was already under strain. Not because of what people could see, but because of everything they couldn't. Power struggles inside an organization rarely stay contained. Pressure always leaks. Signs always appear. In a city like Guadalajara, with its millions of people, its tangled streets, its sprawling suburbs, and its web of political and economic influence, became the place where every unseen tension converged. In public reports and media coverage over the years, Jalisco is often described as a state under constant watch, a region where criminal groups, law enforcement bodies, and political interests intersect in ways that are complex, layered, and often volatile. And this convergence created something dangerous, a city stretched thin. The first form of pressure came from the most obvious source, rival organizations. Throughout recent decades, Mexico's criminal landscape has been marked by fragmentation, breakaways forming new groups, coalitions dissolving, territories shifting back and forth. Whenever one organization becomes powerful, others respond. And though Guadalajara was firmly under the influence of the network rising within Jalisco, rival groups watching from afar saw opportunity in internal friction. Publicly available intelligence assessments often note that external rivals monitor internal instability carefully, waiting for the perfect moment to move. A city strained from the inside becomes vulnerable from the outside. Guadalajara felt that vulnerability long before that night. Reports described subtle signs of pressure along its borders. Unfamiliar vehicles passing through key corridors. Rumors of scouts appearing in small towns. Strange movements along less patrolled highways. Individually, they were minor. Collectively, they painted an unsettling picture. Someone else was watching the internal rift grow. But enemies weren't the only pressure. The second force pressing down on the city was law enforcement, both local and federal, whose presence had increased steadily as major operations in other states pushed criminal activity into new regions. Whenever enforcement intensifies in one zone, activity shifts to another, and Jalisco often found itself carrying that weight. Public safety reports highlight this pattern. Crackdowns in coastal areas pushing traffic inland. Large arrests in neighboring states creating vacuum pockets that redirected routes toward Guadalajara. Federal forces increasing patrols, checkpoints, and intelligence collection. This kind of pressure squeezes the underworld. And when criminal networks feel cornered, they react, sometimes with caution, sometimes with aggression. Officers in Jalisco often described a cat-and-mouse environment, where certain operations triggered sudden spikes in tension. Patrol units noted unusual calm in some districts, unusual movement in others. A hidden system adjusting to pressure in real time. But perhaps the most complex and dangerous form of pressure came from politics. Guadalajara is not just a city, it is a political engine. A place where governors build careers, where elections shift regional balance, where alliances between business, security, and public office carry enormous consequence. And public analyses have long observed that whenever political seasons approach, elections, transitions, appointments, budget changes, criminal networks begin to reposition themselves. New agreements are tested. Old arrangements expire. Influence is renegotiated, silently but powerfully. This isn't speculation, it's a documented pattern across Mexico's security landscape. Moments of political transition often coincide with shifts inside criminal organizations. And this was one of those moments. Across Guadalajara, political tension was rising. Not necessarily in explosive ways, but in the subtle, atmospheric ways analysts recognize. Changes in contracts. Reshuffling of public positions. New security strategies announced and then abruptly reversed. These changes created uncertainty. Uncertainty creates fear. And fear creates instability, not only for the city, but for the organization whose factions were already nearing a standoff. Because whenever political winds shift, criminal networks adjust. And when a network is already split into rival visions, each faction tries to secure influence before the other does. Meetings became more frequent. Whispers more urgent. Unspoken rules more fragile. Inside certain neighborhoods, residents noticed the signs before journalists did. A corner that once had 3 armed lookouts now had 5. Another corner had none, a vacuum that made locals uneasy. Businesses that used to close at midnight began locking up at 9:30. Certain taxis refused to enter specific streets after dark. These weren't coincidences. They were tremors. Guadalajara could feel the ground shifting under its feet. Meanwhile, public security reports revealed an increase in checkpoints, patrol units, and tactical operations across Jalisco. These operations were aimed at containing rising criminal activity, but they also heightened pressure on the organization's fractured leadership. Pressure from rivals. Pressure from law enforcement. Pressure from politics. Pressure from within. 4 walls closing in from every direction. And in the center of those walls? A rivalry that had begun turning inward. Both factions inside the organization interpreted the external pressure differently, and that difference widened the fracture. The structured faction believed the rising pressure required discipline, stability, caution. They wanted to lie low, consolidate operations, and avoid unnecessary attention. Their belief, a storm this big requires patience. The aggressive faction saw the pressure as a challenge, or even an opportunity. When the world becomes unstable, they argued, the bold thrive. Expansion was the answer, not retreat. Their belief, when squeezed, strike. 2 interpretations. 2 strategies. 1 city caught between them. And with every day that passed, Guadalajara felt the tension tighten. More patrols. More checkpoints. More rumors. More unease. People sensed something coming, even if they couldn't name it. Parents told their teenagers not to stay out too late. Commuters took alternate routes home. Taxi drivers shared warnings quietly among themselves. Residents of certain districts reported sudden surges of unfamiliar faces, quickly followed by abrupt disappearances. This wasn't the chaos that would eventually consume the city. This was the pressure building before the break. In public commentary, analysts describe this stage as pre-rupture. A period when the organization is visibly strained but not yet shattered. When signs multiply, but no single event tips the balance. But fractures don't remain silent forever. At some point, pressure becomes too much. At some point, rivals push too far. At some point, a political shift forces a reaction. At some point, one faction makes a move the other sees as a threat. And often, that move happens in the shadows, unseen by the public, undocumented by officials, but felt by everyone involved. In Guadalajara, that move came from a place no one expected. A choice that, according to multiple analyses, wasn't meant to provoke a war, but did. A choice that turned pressure into conflict. Tension into suspicion. Suspicion into retaliation. And retaliation into violence. A spark struck inside a hidden room. A message delivered to the wrong hands. A shipment rerouted without explanation. A conversation overheard by someone who wasn't supposed to hear it. The moment that transformed a rivalry into a fracture. And a fracture into a coming war. What happened next wasn't loud at first. It was subtle. A gesture. A movement. A decision disguised as routine. But this was the moment that set the city on a collision course with the night that would haunt it forever. A night born not in chaos, but in pressure. In fear. In ambition. In politics. In enemies at the gates. In a city strained to its limits. In the decision that triggered everything. It was a meeting hidden behind closed doors, one nobody outside the circle should have known about. But the signal flashed, and then so did everything else. In the world of the cartel Jalisco New Generation, CJNG, rules are carved in blood and loyalty is measured by what you'll risk, not by what you'll gain. Yet on that night something changed. Pause. What followed wasn't an open war. It was a quiet unraveling. A whisper in the corridors, a glance at the wrong time, a name spoken that should never have been spoken, and suddenly the machine turned on itself. We've traced the path. The man who was trusted. The envelope delivered. The phone ring that nobody should have answered. The deal that everyone assumed was sealed. And then the betrayal. It began with ambition, subtle, corrosive, patient. A lieutenant who had been loyal since the earliest days. A man recognized for his cunning, his value, his loyalty. Until he wasn't valuable enough. Until he wasn't safe enough. In the small hours, he crossed a line. Not for money. Not for territory alone. He crossed it for respect. He crossed it because he believed the rules of the game no longer applied to him. And the cartel noticed. Because nothing is more dangerous in that world than a trusted man who believes he has nothing left to lose. One document, one intercepted call, one piece of evidence, still, it only became visible once the damage was done. A shipment diverted. A route quietly handed off. A contact vanished. In one strike, alliances shifted. Smiles masked knives. Brother-in-arms became collaborators of the dark. And the boss, the man known only as El Mencho, realized that his power could not be assumed safe. Pause. In the city of Guadalajara, where the facade of business and ordinary life holds, the betrayal was registered, not with fanfare, but with fear. A quiet phone call after midnight. A guard who didn't report for duty. A street lamp flickering out maybe by chance, or maybe signaling. Then came orders. The kind you don't hear over the radio. You feel them in the engine revving, the footstep in the alley, the sudden flash of metal in the dark. The trigger was pulled. Not yet in the open. Not yet with fireworks. But somewhere, hidden, the line had been crossed. And for every man who had stayed, every man who had watched, panic spread like a virus. Because the betrayal promised more than disloyalty, it promised change. And change means a new order, new rules, and settled debts. In that moment, the streets of Guadalajara did not yet know they were about to run red. But the insiders did. They knew the machine had turned. They knew the sleeping lion had been jabbed. They knew that within hours, every safe corner would be unsafe, every ally a suspect, every route someone else's. The boss made his move. The lieutenant fled, or so he thought. The shipments slowed. The guards were changed. The line was drawn. But the real reaction came not from the top, but from the base. Angry men who believed they had been bypassed. Silent men who believed they had been betrayed. And the ones who believed they could survive by doing nothing. Because in the cartel world, survival is not about doing nothing. It's about acting. And when betrayal enters the room, hesitation is not an option. Then the violence detonates. Pause. And so this betrayal didn't just trigger a hit. It triggered a purge. It triggered retaliation. It triggered a fear so deep that even the markets closed early, the music stopped abruptly, and mothers held their children closer. It triggered the night. In the next chapter, we'll see exactly how the pieces moved, how the first strike was launched, how the streets came alive with shadows, and how the city of Guadalajara became the stage for a power play with no spectators. Stay with me. The night was coming. Not quietly. Not as one might hope. But as a storm gathering behind the horizon of Guadalajara. In the hours before midnight, the city still breathed with routine, the hum of traffic, the laughter spilling out of bars, the street vendors packing and unpacking in the same pattern they had followed for years. Yet beneath it all, something shifted. Something that did not appear on any schedule. Something unseen, a signal passing in the dark like a ghost. Consider the minor interruptions. A convoy of black-tinted SUVs slowed at the toll booth, too slow for a routine run. A motorcycle roared past a family eating tacos, then turned into a side street, leaving a whisper of exhaust. A guard at a warehouse on the outskirts of town failed to check in at the usual time. No alarms went off. But the guard's absence was the alarm. For the men of Cartel de Jalisco New Generation, the night was a canvas on which they would paint their power. For the lieutenant who had betrayed, it was the moment he thought he could escape. For the city itself, it was the beginning of a reckoning, 1/2 hour at a time. Earlier that day, an intercepted message arrived. The content, short, coded, direct, everything changes at 2300 hours. Be ready. It went out to safe houses, compounds, even to a parking garage 3 blocks from where families lived, oblivious. We cannot say who sent the message. We only know it reached eyes that knew its meaning. And once that message is in motion, so is the machine. Across the state, men gathered. The training ranch outside Tucatlan had emptied out its recruits into the shadows, the supply trucks shifted their routes, phones lit up with new contact names. ELPAS English +2 Insight Crime +2 in Guadalajara. The corporate lights stayed on, the clubs still pulsed, but the war rooms whispered. In the late dusk, the city's edge felt different. The air held a rough note. Guns were loaded behind doors. Helmets were pulled down. Trucks that should have carried produce now carried men. Drones took flight, over the hills, across the valley, scanning for movement. Local witnesses would later say they glimpsed them, small humming shadows above the streetlights. ELPAS English +1. At 22:45, the last safe signal. The lieutenant parked his car at the agreed garage, held his breath, unlocked it, found a pistol there which he'd not asked for. He glanced at his phone. A map popped up. A blue dot moved to red. He realized then, there was no negotiation. There was no retreat. He was on the map. Meanwhile, in one plaza in central Guadalajara, a mariachi band was still playing. The city didn't pause. And that was the point. A normal scene, muscles relaxed, unaware. But 10 minutes later, the plaza's lights would flicker. A siren would wail. Shadows would converge. Normality is the perfect disguise. In the offices of the cartel's financial wing, men who handled the money answers received incoming notices, shipments diverted, a courier missing, a branch office locked down. The betrayal had been logged in the margins of spreadsheets, but tonight it would be logged in blood. MrSolutions.com +1. In another part of the city, a taxi driver discovered his windshield cracked. Small, almost negligible. He dismissed it. But someone behind that split had eyes on him. Tonight, no one was safe. The taxi would become a marker. The tire burst would mark a line. The route home would become the route to no return. And so we arrive at the final minutes before the storm unleashed. The clock reads 22:59. 3 men in a rusted van close their doors in a quiet street. A guard across the road flicks his light off. A drone hovers for one more second. The lieutenant strides toward the lined building, heart pounding. He opens the gate. He enters. At that instant, in the main safe house, flickers of movement, men checking their rifles, belts clipped, night vision goggles flipped down. A door clicks shut. A map lights up. Coordinates marked. Names listed. Retribution scheduled. Eyes fixed. Machines engaged. Soon everything would be visible. Fires, sirens, screams, the collapse of rule. But for these final moments, all is still, the calm inside the war machine before its gears grind. The city still expects sleep. The cartel expects conquest. The line between them is a single breath. And when that breath ends, there is no turning back. The night will belong not to innocents, but to those who bet that fear was stronger than law. Stay with me, because what happens next is the first strike. The moment when the parlors of Guadalajara are silenced, when trucks burn and engines stop, and when the streets run red. The clock had struck 2300 hours. In an instant, the quiet that had lingered across Guadalajara vanished. A single gunshot echoed through a narrow alley, followed by another, then a rhythm of steel striking steel, boots pounding pavement, tires skidding on cobblestones. It began at a junction near the edge of the city's historic center, where 2 factions had waited, hidden, and patient. Men who had once shared drinks at the same table now pointed rifles at each other across the darkness. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlights. Every step, every breath, carried the weight of what was about to unfold. A car exploded, the glass shattering like ice under a hammer. Flames licked the tires, painting the walls of nearby buildings in orange. Shops shuttered, windows rattled, dogs howled in fear, and inside homes, mothers pulled children close, whispering prayers they barely believed in. Every movement had a purpose. Every shot was measured. But measured doesn't mean merciful. Across the plaza, a motorcycle skidded into view. 2 men leapt off, rifles raised, moving with a precision that spoke of months of training and years of experience. The sound of the motorbike receded, replaced by a chorus of gunfire. The city became a living map of chaos, alleyways marking danger, rooftops punctuated by shadows and rifles. In the safe houses, the lieutenant's betrayal rippled outward. Men who had trusted him realized too late that they were the targets. Shots rang through walls, bullets drilling doors, splintering wood, breaking lives. Every sound told a story: fear, fury, desperation. And yet, amidst the chaos, the cartel's command chain operated like clockwork. Messages flew over encrypted phones, position secured. Move to secondary route. Couriers raced through side streets, carrying both money and death in equal measure. Every corner, every intersection became a chessboard, and every pawn had become expendable. In one narrow alley, a confrontation turned personal. A man, once a friend of the lieutenant, attempted to reason, to beg, to plead. But words meant nothing. Loyalty had been breached. Betrayal demanded retribution. The gun roared. the alley went silent, save for the echo of a single scream that carried down the cobblestones. Even the city itself seemed to resist, streetlights flickering as if uncertain whether to illuminate or hide the carnage. Smoke began to rise from overturned vehicles, mingling with the fog of fear. The scent of gasoline and gunpowder hung heavy, clinging to the air, a grim perfume that would mark this night forever. Meanwhile, sirens approached, too late to stop the first strike, only announcing what the streets already knew: rules no longer applied. Civilians fled, their footsteps drowned out by gunfire. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores, children were pulled from windows, and the streets emptied into shadows. In the command van at the city's outskirts, the cartel's top lieutenant monitored the strike. Eyes flicked between screens, fingers tracing maps, recalculating routes. Every movement, every death, every street secured was catalogued with meticulous precision. This was more than violence. This was power made tangible, etched into the city's veins with bullets and fire. And yet, even as the first strike succeeded, it revealed something unexpected: resistance. Some men had refused to bend, to flee, to comply. They had armed themselves, hidden themselves, and now engaged in firefights that turned small streets into battlegrounds. It was the beginning of a citywide pulse of violence, unpredictable yet orchestrated. By midnight, the first strike had sent a message that would not be ignored. The betrayal had been answered. The city had been marked. And in that message, hidden between smoke and sirens, was the truth: the streets of Guadalajara would never be the same again. And so the night continued. The first strike was only the opening act. What follows is the full cascade: the streets running red, the city consumed, and the final reckoning that no one living would forget. Stay with me. Because what comes next is the moment the night claimed the city. The night had fallen fully, but darkness alone could not conceal what was about to unfold. Guadalajara's streets, usually alive with music, laughter, and the rhythmic pulse of life, became a canvas for fear. Every alley, every plaza, every corner was suddenly marked by shadows, by men moving like phantoms, rifles in hand, engines idling, and whispers carried on the wind. It began in the Plaza de la Liberación. A single figure stepped from the shadows, checking his rifle, scanning the plaza for signs of resistance. The band that had played earlier in the evening lay silent, their instruments abandoned. Shopkeepers cowered behind shuttered windows. Streetlights flickered, as if the city itself hesitated to illuminate what was coming. And then it began. Shots echoed across the plaza, sharp, precise, devastating. Glass shattered. Concrete vibrated. People ran, screaming, clutching children, clutching their own lives. The violence was not indiscriminate, it was calculated, targeted. Men who had crossed lines, who had betrayed, who had failed, were being removed, one by one, systematically, efficiently. The streets erupted. Black SUVs roared through narrow lanes, motorbikes weaving between terrified civilians. Flames lit from overturned cars. Smoke rose, curling into the night, carrying the stench of gasoline and fear. Bullets pierced walls, windows, doors, each shot a punctuation on a story of betrayal, ambition, and vengeance. In one alley, a former ally crouched behind a dumpster. He thought he had time. He thought he could hide. But movement in the shadows betrayed him. A figure approached, rifle raised, footsteps silent. A single shot. Another life extinguished. No witnesses but the night itself. Across the city, other strikes unfolded simultaneously. Safe houses were stormed. Couriers intercepted. Streets blocked, checkpoints established, terror radiating outward. Every corner of Guadalajara felt the pulse of the cartel's wrath. The betrayal that had ignited this night was being punished, and the message was clear: no one is untouchable. And yet, amid the chaos, ordinary life collided with violence. Families ran blindly into smoke-filled streets, tripping over debris. Shops and homes became obstacles and traps. Innocents were caught in the crossfire, their screams drowned by the roar of engines and the crack of rifles. The city itself became a battlefield, alive with panic, despair, and fire. Some tried to fight back. A few men armed themselves, desperate, defiant. But they were untrained, outnumbered, outgunned. Their resistance was short-lived, a flash in the inferno of calculated terror. Every strike reinforced the lesson: the streets now belonged to the men who had orchestrated this night. In the highest safe house, the cartel's leadership monitored everything. Screens showed maps, camera feeds, intercepted communications. Every move, every casualty, every screen was noted, catalogued, and used to adjust the next strike. This was not chaos. This was control disguised as chaos. By 1 a.m., the city had become unrecognizable. Smoke hung thick in the air. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late to intervene. The plaza was littered with debris. Vehicles burned, their flames reflecting off shattered glass. And throughout the city, bodies marked the passage of power and betrayal, a grim testament to the night's brutality. And still, the violence did not cease. Every corner held a story, every street another calculation. Friends had become enemies. Allies had vanished. The machine of vengeance had accelerated, feeding on betrayal, fear, and the certainty that no mercy would be granted. The city was silent in some pockets, only to erupt moments later. Shadows danced across walls, broken glass sparkled under flickering streetlights, and the echo of gunfire bounced through alleyways like a morbid symphony. The betrayal that had sparked the night had unleashed something unstoppable. Hours passed, but to the city it felt like an eternity. Dawn would eventually come, but only after the night had claimed its due. The streets ran red, not just with blood, but with the knowledge that the rules had been rewritten, that loyalty could no longer be trusted, and that power had a new owner. By the first light, the city counted its losses. The buildings were scarred. Cars smoldered. Smoke still rose from pockets of destruction. And those who survived knew one undeniable truth: the streets of Guadalajara would never be the same. The betrayal had been answered. The power struggle had been resolved, for now. And the message was etched into every corner, every alley, every shadow: cross them, and you will pay. Stay with me, because what comes next is the aftermath, the shockwaves through the city, the human cost, and the long shadow this night would cast over Guadalajara for years to come. Dawn broke over Guadalajara, but the city that greeted the first light was not the city that had gone to sleep. The streets were silent now, but the silence was heavy, thick, and oppressive. Smoke curled from the corners where fires had burned hours before, twisting into the pale light like a warning. Windows were shattered, doors splintered, cars overturned or still smoldering. Every alley held a story of violence, fear, and survival. Those who had survived emerged cautiously, peering into streets littered with debris and unrecognizable shapes. Shopkeepers checked their stores. Families stepped carefully over shattered glass, counting their loved ones, realizing with horror how fragile life had been. Children clung to mothers, fathers scanned every shadow. The ordinary life of a city had been replaced by a nightmare of uncertainty. Police and emergency services arrived, but they were late to the scene. Sirens echoed through the city, but the battle had already been fought, the violence concluded. Officers cataloged the destruction, taking note of the bodies, the abandoned vehicles, the scorched streets. Their presence could not undo what had happened. They were witnesses now, not preventers. Every corner told a different story. In one plaza, a young man counted himself lucky to be alive, hiding behind a toppled bench as gunfire tore through the night. In another street, a mother wept over a neighbor who had been caught in the crossfire, his life extinguished before dawn. In homes and alleys, quiet prayers mingled with the stench of smoke and blood. The betrayal that had triggered the night's violence now rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The lieutenant who had set the chain in motion was missing, his fate unknown. The men who carried out the first strike were returning to their safe houses, checking in with leadership, recounting the hours with grim efficiency. Each death had a purpose, each fire had a message. And that message was clear: power had shifted, and the city would remember. News of the events began to spread. Local media reported sporadically, careful to avoid details that could inflame further violence. Social media carried rumors, videos, fragments of chaos, and eyewitness accounts that were at once horrifying and mesmerizing. Citizens scrolled, watched, and trembled. The story of the night became larger than the night itself, living on in images, whispers, and the memory of those who had seen it firsthand. Even as order slowly returned, the fear remained. Guards patrolled the streets more visibly. Shops remained closed longer. Families stayed inside. The city's rhythm had been broken, and it would take weeks, months, perhaps years, to return to anything resembling normal. And yet, deep down, everyone understood, the night had rewritten the rules. The cartel, having demonstrated its reach and ruthlessness, consolidated power quietly. Safe houses were reinforced. Routes secured. Messages sent, threats implied. Every man who had survived the first strike learned quickly, loyalty now carried a price, and betrayal could cost more than money, it could cost your life. In the shadows, rumors began to circulate of vengeance yet to come, reprisals waiting, debts unsettled. The city had survived one night of terror, but the long shadow of fear had just begun. Guadalajara had witnessed the raw power of ambition and betrayal, and it would never forget. This was the aftermath: a city scarred, a populace shaken, and a cartel strengthened by its ability to enforce its will. But the story does not end here. The ripples of this night would shape alliances, fuel revenge, and set the stage for a conflict that would echo through the streets long after the fires burned out. The night had ended, but its echoes would not fade. Guadalajara awoke to a city marked forever, not just in shattered glass and burned-out cars, but in the hearts and minds of its people. Mothers whispered warnings to children. Shopkeepers counted losses, not just of merchandise but of neighbors, friends, and the fragile sense of security they had once taken for granted. Every corner held a memory of violence, a shadow of the fear that had swept through the streets. The cartel emerged stronger, its message undeniable: betrayal is punished, loyalty enforced, and power is absolute. But even as the men who had orchestrated the chaos retreated into safe houses and shadows, the consequences of that night spread like a contagion. Politicians scrambled to respond. Law enforcement publicly vowed action, yet the truth remained clear: the night had exposed the limits of authority. A city's guardians could not prevent what had been calculated, precise, and hidden until the moment it struck. And so, the people learned a lesson carved in blood: power is sometimes enforced outside the law, and survival depends on vigilance, luck, and obedience. The lieutenant who had triggered the chain of events disappeared from the streets, his fate uncertain. Some say he escaped to another city, protected by shadows and loyalty bought at a price. Others whisper that he did not survive, eliminated quietly to close loose ends. Either way, his name would live in infamy: the man who lit the fuse of the night the streets ran red. Families rebuilt as best they could. Businesses reopened, but with caution. The city itself carried the scars, walls blackened by fire, streets still pockmarked with evidence of violence, neighborhoods quieter than before. Guadalajara had survived, but the city would never be the same. Its rhythm altered, its trust shattered, its people reminded of the fragility of order. And yet, for all the destruction, life continued. Children returned to school, markets reopened, music returned to the plazas. But beneath the surface, the long shadow of that night remained, a reminder that power has consequences, that betrayal has costs, and that even a single night can change the course of a city forever. For those who had orchestrated the events, the night was a victory. For the families caught in the crossfire, it was a tragedy. For the city itself, it was a turning point, the moment when the illusion of normalcy shattered, revealing the fragility beneath. The story of that night is more than a chronicle of violence. It is a story of human ambition, fear, and the dangerous intersection of loyalty and betrayal. It is a story of how one decision can ignite chaos, how one night can change thousands of lives, and how a city can carry the memory of that night in every shadow, every whisper, and every heartbeat. And so, Guadalajara remains, scarred but standing. The cartel's power is evident, but fragile. The people carry on, haunted but resilient. And the night the streets ran red remains a cautionary tale, a night when ambition, betrayal, and vengeance collided, leaving a permanent mark on a city and all who call it home. This is the story of the Jalisco Cartel's power struggle. The story of a single night that became legend, remembered not for the names of its victors, but for the lives forever changed.